Biblical scholars generally agree that there was once a first-century faith-healing fraud and exorcist named Yeshua bar Yosef, whom we will call Jesus. He told his followers to break with Jewish tradition about washing their hands because he didn't know about pathogens, the causes of the diseases he pretended to cure. Instead, he believed in demons. So, not the guy to give medical advice. But even those scholars who don't believe that Jesus was a fraud, even though he was a faith healer, and which means he was a con man, Christian scholars still agree that some things said about Jesus in the Bible are not exactly gospel. Like the tale of the adulteress, when Jesus reportedly said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Biblical scholars agree that never happened. That whole story came from somewhere else, perhaps about someone else. But it got associated with Jesus erroneously sometime later on, after the deadline against accepting new submissions, such that over a dozen other Gospels about Jesus didn't make it into the book. But clips of different parables made their way in that are, let's say, not entirely reliably accurate. And there are several stories like that, where Jesus fed thousands on magically duplicated loaves and fishes, and then sometime later did the exact same miracle again, but his followers, who were with him on both times, were equally amazed both times, as if they didn't know that he could do that after they already saw him do it. No, this never happened once, much less twice. I also heard that the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree, that didn't happen either. That tale was entirely symbolic, metaphorical. And there's things that happen in only one of the Gospels that are significant enough that the others should have mentioned it too, if it had really happened, so probably didn't. Especially since no one remembered these incredible things that everyone should have noticed, and yet no one did. So even though Jesus can be considered a historic character in one sense, in that there was a guy who actually lived at one time, he is not much more historic than Robin Hood or Dracula, because most of what we hear about him and what we hear about them, their real lives are mostly lost, and what we hear about is nonsense. And a lot of it was taken from other sources or stories about other gods and heroes and then appropriated into Jesus' lore. But there are a couple of stories in the gospel that seem believable. Like, remember when Jesus was doing his magical mystery tour and he came to his own hometown? Faith healing requires gullible rubes to either be fooled into thinking that they've been healed and then later figure out that they haven't when they're no longer on stage for the audience to see, or you need actors to play the part to make the audience think that that person was healed, like wheeling somebody up in a wheelchair and then they stand up out of the wheelchair, or when somebody comes in with one leg shorter than the other and then they just sort of turn their hip at the right moment so they, whoa, a miracle, and then the audience is convinced by that, and then they offer cash donations to keep it going. That's how that scam works. As the evangelical faith healer Oral Roberts reportedly said, "There's a lot of exaggeration in this business." You need gullible rubes, people who believe in you. But here, Jesus was bitching that he couldn't do any miracles in Nazareth because the people who knew him best knew better than to believe anything he said. For example, Jesus' own brothers didn't believe that he had any connection to the divine. Well, except for one of them. In Galatians 1:19, the post-apostle Paul claims to have met Cephas, better known as Peter, and James, who was allegedly Jesus' brother. Can't be an older brother, of course, because, virgin birth and all that, but presumably Jesus' biological brother. Although, from what I've read, it seems that there is disagreement, or at least uncertainty, among biblical historians as to whether James, the brother of the Lord, was both Jesus' actual brother and one of the original 12 disciples. That Jesus is actually Jesus' brother seems to be backed up in Matthew 13:55, where a Nazarene who knew Jesus as a child said that the biological brothers of Jesus were James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Jesus was standing right there to correct them if they got the names of his brothers wrong, but he didn't correct them. So we can only assume those were his brothers' names. Of course, we know that Jesus can be a bit catty about that too, because he was, after all, the leader of a cult. It was a death cult, where you were expected to be renunciate, to surrender everything you have unto the Lord, to be rewarded only after you die. In that sense, Jesus was the David Koresh or Jim Jones of his day. One of the typical traits of a religious cult is that they isolate devotees to estrange them from their families. And Jesus says so himself in Luke 12:51-53, where he said that belief in his cult would divide husbands from their wives and parents from their children. Then in Luke 14:26 he goes a bit further, saying that to follow him one must hate their father and their mother and their sister and their brother and their wife and even their own life, devoting themselves entirely to him. In this passage, Jesus sounds a lot like Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. The next step in a cult is to replace old familial relationships with new ones, exclusively among believers in the cult. And this is what Jesus did in Matthew 12:48 through 50, where he denies his mother and his brothers as if he doesn't even know them, saying that his congregation of sycophants have become his new family. So it is clear that Jesus did not care about family values. Still, Jesus had brothers that we don't know much about, one of them named Judas. We know that Jesus was not betrayed by his own brother, but by a different Judas. Judas Iscariot is not Jesus' brother because Iscariot is a byname that means of Cariot, a town in Judea. Just like we would say Jesus of Nazareth to show that he is not Jesus of Cariot. Or more likely, Mary Magdalene, which means Mary from the town of Magdala. And Judas is apparently the only one of the apostles who hails from Cariot. And what about Jesus' other brother, Simon? Is he the Simon who is also known as Peter? Well, Paul stayed with someone whom he said was one of the original apostles, one named Peter, also known as Cephas. But Paul did not say that Peter was Jesus' brother, only James. So we must be talking about a different Simon, not the one known as Cephas, maybe not the one known as Peter either. It is confusing who it was that Paul stayed with in Jerusalem, because Simon, known as Peter, was the apostle who is sometimes called Simon Peter, as if everyone knows him as Simon Peter, probably because there was another apostle, Simon, who was a zealot. But Paul never referred to Peter as Simon. To Paul, Peter was not Simon, but Cephas. Oh, wait, because Jesus changed Simon's name. He said, no, you're Cephas now. So what are you going to do? Defy the cult leader? That usually turns out poorly. And Jesus could say, henceforth ye shall be known as Buttercup. And you're a buttercup from then on. What are you going to do? Deal with it. As I said, there was another Simon among the apostles, but that was Simon the Cananaean, the only one of the group who hailed from Canaan. He wasn't Simon of Nazareth, though, so that Simon can't be Jesus' brother either. What about Jesus' another brother, Joseph? Well, there's no Joseph listed among the apostles. There is a John, and that's important because Matthew 10 says that James is the brother of John, and that they are both the sons of Zebedee, not Joseph, who was the father listed on Jesus' birth certificate. Jesus didn't have a brother named John, and his father wasn't Zebedee either. And there was another apostle, James, this one the son of Alphaeus, and apparently brother of Matthew the evangelist, unless there is a second father Alphaeus we don't know about. Jesus didn't have a brother named Matthew, and his father wasn't Alphaeus either. However, despite all of this, Christians often assume that this was Jesus' brother, even from a different father and a virgin mother, and that this James was the same James that Paul met after his conversion, James the Just, brother of the Lord, who knows the Apostle John pretty well, but it seems that maybe they're not brothers. And how could Jesus have a brother named James, who is also the son of another father, yet Jesus is not also the brother of John, nor of Matthew either? You can be someone's brother and not share the same dad. And in Bible times, there were often brothers of another mother, but usually the same dad. However, we know that even in that culture, people got divorced and remarried, including when a man marries another man's ex-wife. We know that happened because Jesus complained about it passionately. I wonder why Jesus was so dead set against anyone ever marrying anyone's ex-wife. He was explicit about it. He called that adultery. In his case, his mother was supposed to be a virgin when she became pregnant with Jesus, and Catholic dogma insists that she remained a virgin her whole life.
The nature of God and the virgin birth, those are leaps of faith. But to believe a married couple never got down, well, that's just plain gullibility.
Nonetheless, Catholics insist, and even some non-Catholic theologians agree, that James was only a stepbrother to Jesus, Joseph's son from a prior marriage, which is interesting. But remember, this is James, son of Alphaeus, not James, son of Joseph. There is no James, son of Joseph. Other Christians don't take the position that Mary remained a virgin because that is nowhere indicated, and it isn't necessary, and it doesn't make any sense, especially since we know that Mary wasn't necessarily a virgin.
In the quiet words of the Virgin Mary, come again.
Okay, no one knows who wrote the Gospel of Matthew anonymously, but it wasn't an eyewitness. Whoever it was, they based their story on a misreading of a prophecy from Isaiah 7, wherein, several centuries earlier, the king of Judah was worried that he might eventually be conquered by combined Syrian and Israeli forces. Some things never change, it seems. So the prophet Isaiah assured the king not to worry about it, that it wasn't going to happen. To put the king's worried mind at ease, Isaiah offered a prophecy that the king could see fulfilled in his own time. Isaiah said, "This maiden is pregnant, and she will soon give birth to a son. Before the child is old enough to choose between curds and honey, you will see that your enemies are no longer a threat to you." So we're talking about an unremarkable kid who would have lived and died several centuries before Jesus, and whose only importance was to mark the passage of a couple of years. There's a lot more to the story, and it is hilariously tragic, but another time. The important part right now is that the mother-to-be is described as Alma, maiden, not Bethulah, virgin, and Isaiah thought that she was already pregnant, not that she was going to become pregnant. So there is no way that this prophecy means that the Messiah would be born of a virgin centuries later. But that is how the author of Matthew misunderstood it. So this anonymous author of that first chapter of Matthew misread Isaiah and decided that Mary should be a virgin. So he created the surrounding tale of the ghostly conception and the virgin birth, with, complete with the other symbolic references to the manger and the guiding star and the three Zoroastrian magi, into a narrative that sounded good from his perspective, given his belief in culture. Remember, early Christians, including Paul himself, were mystics who did not restrict themselves to the testable facts, but instead interpreted dreams as if they were divine revelation. So the gospel authors could just make up whatever they like and call it revealed truth. But the fact remains, that wasn't Isaiah's prophecy. Mary wasn't necessarily a virgin. And she may not have been. With so many people distorting the data and not knowing the reality and putting their own interpretations onto other people's private lives, it's hard to know what really happened. It might be that Jesus' mother Mary was actually Alphaeus' ex-wife. Even if she was married at 14 and had 2 kids by him, she still would have been underage by the time she hooked up with Joseph. So Joseph is just a stepfather, like they said he was going to be anyway. He was going to play the part of a cuck either way. This might be why Jesus told Joseph,
"You're not my real dad!"
We know the Bible isn't big on naming women because they're not important enough. We know each of Jesus' brothers' names, and we know that he had sisters too. But we don't know any of their names because they're just girls. But we know that Jesus' mother's name is Mary. So do we know who the mother of this other James was? Matthew 27:56 says that there were 3 women at Jesus' trial and execution. One of them was Mary Magdalene. Another was Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. But that's Mary, the mother of Jesus also. So why didn't they say that? Why do they instead identify her with these 2 of her 5 children? Are James and Joseph both the sons of Alphaeus? Men often name their firstborn after themselves, so maybe Mary was the mother of James, the son of Alphaeus, and also the mother of Joseph Jr. by different dads. Or, there could just be that there were a lot of Josephs about then, like there were a lot of Jesuses too. The third woman at the crucifixion was Salome, who was also called Mary. Thus, the women at the execution are known collectively as the 3 Marys. Because we can't have people with different names. Everybody has to have the same name.
Is your name not Bruce then?
No, it's Michael.
That's going to cause a little confusion.
So there was a time when every girl was named Mary, and every guy was named James or John or Jesus or Joseph, even though there are no J's in that language, oddly enough. Amusingly, it seems that Mary, who is also Salome, was called Salome because she was the Virgin Mary's sister. So they named Mary's sister Mary.
This is my brother Daryl. That's my other brother Daryl.
Mary's sister Mary, who was also Salome, was also the wife of Zebedee, father of James and John. Zebedee was apparently also the brother of Joseph, who was Jesus' stepdad and probably the real father of Simon and Judas of Nazareth, though maybe not necessarily the father of Joseph and or James, son of Alphaeus. Maybe James really is Jesus' older brother after all. So Mary's sister Mary married her sister's husband's brother. And it doesn't matter which Mary you thought we were going to start with, because it works either way, the same way. It's a close family, uncomfortably so. It's getting like rural Alabama in here. But I'm beginning to think that maybe Sister Mary might not have been quite as pure as we already knew that she didn't have to be. I mean, I'm sure it's never happened that a young lady left some man and then discovered that she was pregnant with her ex's kid. But even if that much has happened, I'm sure that every woman who ever found out that she was pregnant after a breakup always reported it to the father, even when he was someone that she no longer wanted to have as part of her life. I'm sure it's never happened that a woman would keep that sort of thing secret from him. And I'm sure that no woman has ever blamed the baby on someone else instead. But if any of that happened in this instance, sure would explain a lot.